A billionaire CEO walked into her own conference room and stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. Her 8-year-old daughter was standing at a whiteboard-covered floor to ceiling in equations advanced probability models that Nexora's highest-paid engineers had been staring at for 4 days without a solution. The little girl wasn't struggling. She was humming. Camille Westbrook said one word, Ruby. Her daughter turned around, marker still in hand, completely calm. "I finished it, Mom." Camille looked at the board, then back at her child. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Who taught you that?" If a story like this makes you stop and think you're in the right place, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next is going to stay with you. The conference room on the 31st floor of Nexora Dynamics had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that never seemed to sleep. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the skyline glittered like something out of a postcard, indifferent and enormous. Camille Westbrook barely noticed it anymore. She hadn't really looked at a view in years. She was walking back from her third meeting of the evening, a brutal 2-hour session with the federal contracts team about the logistics platform demonstration, scheduled for the end of the month, when she pushed open the glass door to Conference Room C and found the room already occupied. Ruby was standing with her back to the door. She was 8 years old and small for her age, with dark hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail that someone, probably Ruby herself, had attempted and given up on halfway through. She was standing on her toes to reach the upper section of the whiteboard, and she was writing without hesitation. Numbers, brackets, variable strings, annotated lines connecting one cluster of figures to another. Camille stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. The board was filled with something that looked remarkably, uncomfortably close to the probability distribution framework that Nexora's senior engineering team had been wrestling with for the better part of a week. Not a child's imitation of math. Not copied symbols she didn't understand. The logic was there, the scaffolding was correct, the relationships between variables tracked. "Camille," said Ruby. Ruby turned around. She held a blue dry erase marker in one hand, the cap in the other. She did not look startled. She looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced at being interrupted. "I finished it," she said. Camille walked slowly into the room. She stood beside her daughter and looked at the board for a long time, without speaking. She wasn't a mathematician herself. Her strengths had always been business strategy, capital structure, reading a room, but she had spent enough time with Nexora's engineering presentations to recognize what she was looking at. What she was looking at was not elementary school mathematics. She crouched down to Ruby's level, which she remembered reading somewhere was what you were supposed to do when talking to a child. She and Ruby did not have many conversations where she remembered to do that. "Ruby, where did you learn this?" Ruby considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, with a pause that felt longer than it should for an 8-year-old. "Mr. Dean taught me." Camille waited. "Mr. Dean, he works downstairs. He cleans the floors." Ruby glanced at the board, then back at her mother. "He showed me how numbers have shapes, and if you know what shape they make, you can figure out where they're going." Camille straightened up slowly. She looked at the board again. The date in the corner of the whiteboard was today's. Ruby had written it herself, in the careful block print she always used. "Where's Mrs. Hoang?" Camille asked. Mrs. Hoang was Ruby's after-school minder, a calm Taiwanese woman in her 60s who had worked for Camille for 2 years and was extremely reliable. "She fell asleep in your office," Ruby said without judgment. "She does that when you're in late meetings. I came to find the good markers." Camille did not say anything for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Go wake Mrs. Hoang and get your bag. We're going home." Ruby put the cap back on the marker and set it on the tray. She looked at the board one more time with an expression that Camille could not quite name, not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride, and then she walked out of the conference room without another word. Camille stayed behind. She stood there for 4 minutes looking at what her daughter had written on that board. At some point she took out her phone and photographed it. Then she sent the photograph to Marcus Chen, Nexora's head of software engineering, with a message that said only, "Look at this. Tell me what you see." His response came back in under a minute. "Where did you get this?" "This is the framework we've been trying to build for the Halcyon demo." "Who did this?" Camille pocketed her phone. She went to find her daughter. The drive home was 22 minutes in light traffic, which was unusual for the city at that hour. Ruby sat in the back seat beside Mrs. Hoang and looked out the window. She didn't talk much on drives. She never had, not since she was 5. Not since the year her father died of a fast and merciless cardiac event that no one had seen coming. Not since the year Camille had gone back to work 3 weeks after the funeral, because stopping felt like the only thing that would actually kill her. Ruby had been 3 when Marcus Westbrook died. She had almost no memory of him that wasn't from photographs. Camille sometimes wondered if that was better or worse, no specific loss to mourn, just a shape of a person-sized absence that had always been there. The therapist Ruby had seen over the years said she was processing it in her own way. They also said she was intellectually advanced and socially guarded, and that what she needed most was consistent patient connection. Camille provided everything for her daughter: a beautiful home, the best school in the city, books, tutors, weekend activities, trips to museums and science centers. She arranged all of it and missed most of it, and felt guilty about both. She looked at Ruby in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Dean," she said, keeping her voice even. "How long has he been teaching you?" Ruby considered. "Since October, I think." It was now late February. 4 months, Camille said. "He doesn't teach me like school," Ruby said, still looking out the window. "He gives me problems and then he waits. He doesn't tell me the answer. He just waits. And if you get it wrong, he says, 'Interesting. What made you try it that way?'" Ruby paused. "And then he gives me a harder one." Camille said nothing else for the rest of the drive. She couldn't sleep that night. She lay in a king-sized bed in a house she had decorated once and never redecorated because she never had the time or the desire, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about a man she had never once noticed cleaning the floors below her offices. At midnight, she got up and opened her laptop and pulled up Nexora's employee database. She searched the maintenance and facilities staff. Dean Kessler. Age 37, night maintenance, floors B1 through 6. Employed 14 months. Performance record, clean, no incidents. Emergency contact, self. That was all. She stared at the record for a long time. Then she opened a separate window and sent a brief, precise message to the head of Nexora's private security division. "I need a discrete background report. Employee file attached. Full history. Everything you can find. Have it on my desk by Thursday." She closed the laptop. She did not feel good about what she had just done. She had done it anyway. The next afternoon, Camille did not go directly into her 4 o'clock board call. Instead, she took the stairs down to the basement level the long way, through the parking structure, so no one she knew would see her. She stood in a corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and old concrete and fluorescent light, and she waited. She heard them before she saw them. Ruby's voice, high and focused, with that particular intensity she got when she was working on something that interested her. But if the first value is wrong, doesn't that make everything after it wrong too? And a man's voice, low and unhurried, with a quality that Camille couldn't immediately name. Not necessarily. "Try it. What happens if you isolate just the second sequence and treat the first as a constant?" "But the first isn't a constant." "I know. Try it anyway." "What do you learn from the attempt?" A pause. Then the sound of something being written pencil on paper. Fast scratches. Camille moved to the doorway. The basement break room was not a pleasant space. Vending machines along one wall. A folding table pushed against the other. A row of plastic chairs that had seen better decades. Against the far wall, a mop bucket and a cleaning cart loaded with supplies, and beside the cart, sitting in 2 of those plastic chairs, were Ruby and a man Camille had never consciously seen before. Dean Kessler was lean and not particularly tall, with the kind of stillness that some people carried as tension, and he seemed to carry as something else entirely. His maintenance uniform was gray. His hands, she noticed, were large and square, and he was holding a paper cup with several coins balanced on the rim, which he had apparently been using to demonstrate something. On the folding table between them were several sheets of paper covered with hand-drawn diagrams. He was not looking at Camille. He was watching Ruby work. The look on his face, Camille registered it before she thought about it. Was not indulgence, not the slightly performative patience of adults entertaining a smart child. It was genuine attention. The way one person watches another person do something they actually believe the second person can do. Then Ruby made a small sound of discovery and looked up. She saw her mother in the doorway. The color in Ruby's face shifted. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something complicated and small. Dean turned then, unhurried, and looked at Camille. "Ms. Westbrook," he said, not surprised, not afraid, just noting her presence. Camille walked into the room. She was aware that she was in a $4,000 suit in a basement break room, and she was aware that she was angry in a way she hadn't quite expected to be, and she was aware that she wasn't entirely sure who she was angry at. "Ruby," she said, "go upstairs and wait with Mrs. Huang." Ruby didn't argue. She gathered her papers with careful hands and slid off the chair and left without a word. When she was gone, Camille turned to Dean. She kept her voice controlled. "She's 8 years old. She is not your student. You work for this company in a building maintenance capacity, and whatever arrangement you've built with my daughter ends today." She paused. "I don't know what you thought you were doing, but she's not." "She was solving number patterns on waste paper from the recycling bins," Dean said. Camille stopped. He wasn't aggressive about it. He said it the way someone states a fact, if simply observed. She was sitting outside Conference Room A in October. It was about 10 at night. I was running a mop through the hallway, and she was sitting on the floor with a stack of paper from the recycling bin next to the shredder, and she was working through number sequences. He set the paper cup down on the table. I asked her what she was doing. She showed me. I gave her a harder one. He paused. She solved it in about 4 minutes, and then she looked up at me and asked for another one. So I drew her one. Camille said nothing. "I'm not trying to overstep," Dean said. He still hadn't raised his voice. "She's a remarkable kid. And I mean that plainly, not as a compliment I'm offering you. I mean she thinks in a way most adults don't. She needs problems that match what she's actually capable of." He met Camille's eyes. "Your daughter doesn't need easier problems, Ms. Westbrook. She needs someone who believes she can solve the hard ones." The room was quiet. The vending machine hummed. Somewhere above them, the building shifted the way large buildings do at night. Camille looked at the table, at the hand-drawn diagrams, the scattered coins, the paper cup, the pencil marks. She looked at the chair Ruby had been sitting in, which was still slightly angled toward Dean's, the way two people sit when they're working on something together, and neither of them has remembered to be self-conscious about it. She looked back at Dean. There was something in his face she couldn't immediately account for. Not arrogance, she dealt with arrogance every day and knew what it looked like in all its forms. Not calculation. Something settled. The way a person looks when they know who they are and have stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "This stops," she said. Starting tonight, she turned and left the basement. On the elevator back to the executive floor, she stood very still and stared at the panel of buttons and thought about the look on Ruby's face when she'd walked into that room. Not the guilt, the thing underneath it. The way Ruby had been sitting in that plastic chair, shoulders down, head forward, completely present, in a way Camille couldn't remember seeing her sit anywhere in recent memory. She told herself it didn't matter. She had made the correct decision. She pressed the button for 31 and watched the floors climb. Ruby didn't speak much at dinner that night, or the night after. By the end of the first week, she had stopped bringing math papers home from school. She sat at meals with her fork moving food in slow circles and her eyes somewhere past the window, and when Camille asked what she was thinking about, she said, "Nothing." Camille knew what nothing meant. She had been saying it herself for years. She told herself the arrangement had been inappropriate. She told herself Ruby had other resources, better resources, structured and credentialed and properly supervised. She told herself she had done the responsible thing. She told herself this with some frequency, which was its own kind of answer. The background report landed on her desk that Thursday. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the city. She could no longer see and thought about a 37-year-old man with large, square hands sitting in a basement break room with a paper cup full of coins, teaching her daughter how numbers have shapes. The report was not what she had expected, not even close. The file was 41 pages. Camille had expected maybe 12. A work history, a few addresses, perhaps a minor legal matter that would justify her discomfort and confirm that she had been right to intervene. What she got instead was a document that made her sit in her chair for 20 minutes after she finished reading it, doing nothing but turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Dean Allen Kessler, born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, a school cafeteria during the day, a laundry service on weekends in a neighborhood that didn't offer a lot of soft landings. He had been an average student who, according to the one teacher quote the investigator had tracked down through public records, was the kind of kid who only works hard when the problem is worth his time. He enlisted in the Navy at 18, which his mother had reportedly not spoken to him about for 3 months. What came after 18 was not average. He passed basic underwater demolition SEAL training in his first attempt, a selection process that eliminated somewhere between 70 and 80% of candidates in a typical cycle. He deployed 6 times. The file listed his operational specializations: small unit tactics, route reconnaissance, target pattern analysis, probability-based threat assessment, applied navigation under degraded conditions. The report's sourcing was careful here. The investigator had worked from public military records, honorable discharge documentation, and a handful of news archives, but the outline was clear enough. Dean Kessler had spent a decade doing work that required him to think faster and more precisely than almost anyone around him, in conditions where a wrong answer was not a setback but a funeral. He left the Navy at 29. The report was vague on the specific circumstances, which Camille's investigator had flagged in a note. Discharge honorable. Reason for separation not specified in public record. 2 sources suggest a mission-related incident approximately 8 months prior. Details classified. The investigator had added, with visible reluctance, "This is the limit of what I can verify through available channels." What happened next was easier to trace, though not easier to understand. Dean had turned down 3 separate offers in the private security sector within a year of discharge. The investigator had located documentation on 2 of them. Both were firms that contracted with multinational corporations. Both were offering 6-figure salaries. He turned them down. He spent 2 years doing contract consulting work. The report listed a logistics firm, a port authority risk assessment, 1 semester as an adjunct instructor at a community college teaching, applied mathematics to adults returning to education. He was apparently, by one former colleague's account, a better teacher than he thought he was, and more impatient than he admitted. Then 8 years ago, Dean's son Caleb had been born. The mother's name was listed in the report with a brief note: relationship ended prior to birth. Custody arrangement, full custody to Dean Kessler by mutual agreement, formalized through family court. No further detail. The investigator had not pursued it, and Camille found she didn't want to either. That particular chapter wasn't her business. What followed was a man systematically reorganizing his entire life around a child. The consulting work dried up not because he failed at it, but because it required travel. He moved to the city when Caleb was 2 closer to his mother, who had retired by then and could help with childcare during the transition. He took the night maintenance job at Nexora 14 months ago. The hours were 6 in the evening to 2 in the morning, which meant he was home when Caleb woke up, home for breakfast, home for school drop-off. He slept while Caleb was in class. He was there every afternoon. The investigator's concluding note read, "Subject has no criminal record, no civil judgments, no outstanding financial irregularities. No red flags identified." For what it's worth, and I recognize this falls outside the scope of a standard background report, every person I spoke with who knows him said roughly the same thing. He's the most capable person they've ever worked with, who actively chose not to be recognized for it. Camille read that line 3 times. She closed the file. She sat in her glass-walled office on the 31st floor, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built and accumulated and fought for, and she thought about a man who had chosen a night job that paid $22 an hour because it let him be home in the morning. She thought about Ruby sitting in that plastic chair with her shoulders down. She thought about herself, 3 weeks after her husband's funeral, walking back into this building because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. She picked up the file again and turned to the section on the community college teaching. There was a quote from a department administrator who had known Dean during that semester. He had this thing where he'd give a student a problem that was too hard for them and then just wait, not hover, just go quiet. And they'd panic a little and work, and usually they'd get further than they expected. He said the most important thing you could teach anyone was that discomfort wasn't the same as failure. Camille put the file in her desk drawer. She did not call Dean that day. She did not call him the next day either. What she did instead was watch Ruby. She tried to be subtle about it, and she was probably not as subtle as she thought. Ruby was a perceptive child. She noticed things, cataloged them quietly, said nothing until she had decided what to do with the information. She got that from somewhere. Camille suspected it wasn't from her. The withdrawal was not dramatic. Ruby still went to school, still ate dinner, still read before bed. She was reading a book about cryptography that Camille had found baffling when she looked at the back cover, and Ruby had explained the basic premise of it in about 90 seconds with a patience that suggested she was aware she was simplifying. But the quality of her presence in the house had changed. There was a flatness to it. She sat at the kitchen table and did her homework, and the homework was correct and complete and wholly mechanical, like watching someone go through motions they've decided are pointless. One evening, 9 days after Camille had ended the basement lessons, Ruby looked up from her math worksheet and said, "This is too easy." Camille, who was sitting across from her reviewing a contracts brief, looked up. "Your math homework?" "All of it." Ruby pressed the eraser end of her pencil against the paper. "Everything they give us at school. I finish it in like 10 minutes, and then I just have to sit there." "Have you talked to your teacher about it?" "She said I could do extra credit." Ruby's tone made her precise feelings about extra credit abundantly clear. It's just more of the same problems. More of the easy ones. Camille looked at her daughter. She wanted to say the right thing and did not know what it was. "I can look into some enrichment programs. There are." "That's okay," Ruby said. She went back to her worksheet. "It's fine." It was not fine. They both knew that. But Ruby had said it's fine in the same flat, polite tone that Camille sometimes used when she didn't want to have the actual conversation. And Camille recognized it with a jolt of discomfort she chose not to examine directly. She went back to her contracts brief. The halcyon crisis began, as most crises did, not with a bang, but with a number that was slightly wrong. Nexor's logistics platform, officially designated Halcyon, internally called the project that had consumed 3 years and $400 million of development, was built to manage complex supply chain routing for large-scale government infrastructure operations. The federal contract it was designed to fulfill was the largest in Nexora's history. The demonstration was scheduled for the 28th of the month in front of a room full of government procurement officials who had been patient long enough and wanted to see the system work. It had been working. For 6 months of internal testing, it had been working beautifully. Then, 17 days before the demonstration, a routing simulation returned a probability distribution that was fractionally off. Not wrong enough to fail. Just wrong enough to be noticed by someone paying close attention, which Marcus Chen happened to be that morning, because he had not slept and was on his 3rd coffee and had a habit of rechecking figures that other people had already signed off on. He flagged it. The engineering team spent 2 days assuming it was a calibration error and corrected it. The simulation ran clean. Everyone moved on. 4 days later it happened again. Different variable cluster. Same quality of wrongness, not dramatic, not obvious. The kind of error that looked almost like noise, until you started looking at when it occurred and realized it was patterned. Marcus brought it to Camille on a Thursday afternoon with a look on his face that she had learned to take seriously. He was a compact, methodical man who had been with Nexora for 7 years and who expressed concern the way accountants expressed concern, quietly, precisely, and only when the numbers genuinely warranted it. "It's not random," he said, setting a printed summary on her desk. "I've gone back through the simulation logs. It's occurring at specific processing intervals in specific variable clusters, and the pattern of deviation has a consistency to it that doesn't match any of our known error types." Camille looked at the summary. "Hardware? We've ruled it out. Software conflict? A bad update? We've gone through everything. The platform's own error detection isn't flagging it because whatever is happening looks like valid data. It's passing all the internal checks." He paused. "Which means it's either something we genuinely don't understand about the system, or something that was deliberately designed to pass those checks." The room was quiet for a moment. "How many people are working on it?" Camille asked. "Currently, 31 engineers across 3 teams." He hesitated. "Camille, if we don't identify and resolve this before the 28th, we cannot do the demonstration. And if we delay the demonstration, I know what happens if we delay." She picked up the summary. "Keep everyone on it. I want daily updates." Marcus nodded and left. Camille spent the next week watching 31 engineers fail to find the source of the problem, which was its own particular kind of dread. These were not mediocre engineers. Several of them had advanced degrees from institutions that had waiting lists. They had access to every diagnostic tool the company owned, every log, every line of code, every data record going back to the platform's first test run. They worked in shifts, so the investigation ran around the clock. They found nothing. The deviations continued. By the 3rd week, the mood in the engineering wing had gone from focused to grim. People were working longer hours and getting less done, and starting to repeat each other's failed approaches because they had run out of new ideas and didn't want to admit it. Camille sat in on 3 team briefings and came away from all 3 with the same unsettled feeling she got when she watched someone search for their keys in a room where the keys weren't actually located. Graham Sutter attended the last of those briefings. Graham was Nexora's chief operating officer, a tall, impeccable man in his mid-40s, with a facility for projecting calm authority that Camille had admired when she hired him and had occasionally found difficult to read since. He had an MBA from a school that liked to remind you it was highly ranked, a background in corporate restructuring, and a precise understanding of organizational politics that he wore lightly enough that most people didn't notice how carefully he deployed it. At the briefing, he sat at the far end of the table and asked measured questions and expressed measured concerns and said, at the end, that he had full confidence in the engineering team's ability to resolve the issue before the deadline. We should also be considering contingency positions, he added, almost as an aside. If the demonstration does need to be delayed, we want a communication strategy ready, something that controls the narrative and protects the board's confidence in current leadership. Camille had looked at him across the table. I'm not planning for delay, Graham. Of course not, he said. I'm just being thorough. It was a reasonable thing to say. She had filed it away and not thought about it again until later, when she would wish she had. On a Tuesday evening, 12 days before the demonstration, Camille came home to find Ruby sitting at the kitchen table with a single sheet of paper in front of her, not writing anything, just sitting. She had her chin resting in one hand, and she was looking at the paper with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite boredom, something in between that had no good name. Camille put her bag down and sat across from her. She didn't say anything immediately. After a moment, Ruby said, I've been thinking about the error. Camille frowned slightly. What error? The one in the platform. I heard you talking to Mr. Chen on the phone last week. You were in your study, and the door wasn't completely closed. Ruby said this without apology. You said the errors had a pattern, but nobody could find the source. Ruby, I was just thinking, Ruby said, that if the pattern exists, but the system doesn't recognize it as wrong, maybe the problem isn't in the system. Maybe the system is working exactly the way someone told it to work. She paused. Mr. Dean said once that the hardest problems to solve aren't the ones where something is broken. They're the ones where everything is working correctly and still producing the wrong answer. He said that means you need to go back to the assumptions. Camille sat very still. He called it an upstream problem, Ruby continued. He said in navigation, if your compass reads true north and you still end up in the wrong place, you don't recalibrate the compass. You figure out who set the starting coordinates. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the wet street. Camille said carefully, where did he teach you that? Ruby looked up. One of our lessons. In October, I think, or maybe November. We were talking about how some mistakes aren't really mistakes. She picked up her pencil and put it down again. He would know what to look for, Mom. In the halcyon thing. He'd know where to start. Ruby, I'm just saying. She pushed back her chair and picked up her sheet of paper. He would. She went upstairs. Camille stayed at the kitchen table. She sat there for a long time after Ruby's footsteps faded, in a kitchen that was tastefully designed and adequately warm, and always, always too quiet. The next morning, she called Marcus. I have an unconventional suggestion, she said, and I want you to hear it fully before you respond. There was a brief pause on his end. That phrasing has never preceded something I was happy about. I want to bring Dean Kessler in to look at the halcyon problem. A longer pause, Dean Kessler, night maintenance, lower floors. Another pause, longer still. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had the particular tone of a very patient man deciding how much patience he had left. Camille, we have 31 engineers who have been working for 3 weeks and have not found the source of the problem. That doesn't mean a janitor. He's a former Navy SEAL with a background in pattern analysis and probability assessment, Camille said. He has a decade of operational experience solving problems under conditions that were considerably more consequential than a logistics platform. And she stopped herself. She had been about to say, and my 8-year-old daughter has more mathematical intuition than half your team, after 4 months of informal lessons from him, and she recognized that this was both true and probably not the most effective argument to make at this moment. And I have reason to believe his approach to the problem will be different enough from current efforts that it might be worth the time it takes. Marcus was quiet. 3 hours, she said. Let me bring him in for 3 hours. If he finds nothing, we've lost 3 hours. If word gets out that we brought in a janitor to fix a billion-dollar system, then we'll deal with that when it happens. Right now our problem is the system, not the optics, she waited. Marcus, we have 12 days, he exhaled. Fine, 3 hours. She found him at 6:15 the following evening, at the start of his shift, in the equipment room on the B1 level. He was checking supply inventory on a clipboard, and he did not look up immediately when she came in, because he had apparently not yet registered that his employer had never previously visited the B1 equipment room. "Mr. Kessler," she said. He looked up then. He took in the situation, her presence, the hour, the fact that she had clearly come down specifically to find him with the same unruffled attention she had noticed the first time. "Ms. Westbrook, I need to talk to you about something." He set the clipboard on the shelf. "Okay, I have a problem I'd like you to look at." She paused because she had rehearsed this and it still felt strange to say. A technical problem. With the Halcyon platform. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The way a person looks when something they'd already thought about becomes a current conversation. "What kind of problem?" she told him. Not everything. She kept the details at the level of overview, pattern of error, timeline, what the engineering team had and hadn't been able to identify. She spoke for about 4 minutes. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said the errors passed the platform's own validation checks," he said. "Yes, and the engineering team's been focusing on the code and the hardware. Primarily. What about the data being fed into the system? Not the platforms processing the inputs themselves." "They've reviewed the data sources." "Who controls the data sources?" he asked. "I mean operationally. Who has access to modify input parameters before they reach the platform?" Camille looked at him. It was not the question Marcus's team had been asking. She realized, standing in a supply room that smelled cleaning chemicals and old metal, that it was the question nobody had been asking. "That's a short list," she said slowly. "It usually is." He picked up the clipboard again, then set it back down. "Ms. Westbrook, I'll look at it on one condition." She waited. The lessons with Ruby start again. The room was very quiet. Camille had known him for approximately 1 week, and in that week she had read his complete history, dismissed him, watched her daughter go gray with quiet, sat at a kitchen table listening to an 8-year-old explain upstream problems, and driven to work the next morning with a feeling she didn't have a clean name for. She said yes. He nodded once. "When do you need me upstairs?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. 7 o'clock. I'll need access to the system logs. All of them, not summaries. And I want to see the error data plotted chronologically, not categorized by type. I'll have it ready." He picked up his clipboard and turned back to his inventory. "Tell Rubies I said hello," he said without looking up. Camille walked back to the elevator. In the metal doors, before they opened, she caught her own reflection for a moment, a woman in an expensive suit standing in a basement, having just made a deal with the janitor that involved her daughter's well-being and a billion-dollar government contract in the same breath. She looked tired. She thought, like someone who had been making very confident decisions for a very long time, and was only now beginning to wonder how many of them had actually been correct. The doors opened. She stepped in and rode up to the 31st floor, where everything was glass and light, and the city spread out in every direction like a map of something she had always assumed she understood. She was less certain of that than she'd been yesterday. She was even less certain of something else, that the most dangerous person in her building was the one she'd spent 3 weeks ignoring in the basement. It was not Dean Kessler she was thinking about. It was Graham Sutter and his very reasonable question about contingency positions and the short list of people with access to Halcyon's input parameters, and the way his calm had never once flickered in any of those engineering briefings, not even when 31 engineers couldn't find what should have been findable. She stood in the elevator and felt the building move beneath her feet. 12 days was not a lot of time. He arrived at 7:03. Camille had told herself she wouldn't note the 3 minutes, and she noted them anyway, and then felt faintly ridiculous about it. Dean came off the elevator on the 31st floor, wearing his gray maintenance uniform. He had apparently not considered changing, or had considered it and decided against it, which amounted to the same statement, carrying a battered canvas bag over one shoulder and a paper coffee cup from the cart in the lobby. He looked exactly the same as he looked in the basement. Unhurried, present, unimpressed by the surroundings, which in themselves were designed to impress. Marcus was already in the main engineering suite when Camille brought Dean in. He had arranged the system logs on 3 large monitors along one wall, the error data printed and stacked in chronological order on the conference table, and the Halcyon interface open on a 4th screen showing a live read of the platform's current state. He had done all of this with professional competence and was now sitting in a chair by the window with his coffee and the expression of a man who had decided to keep an open mind and was finding it more difficult than expected. There were two other engineers in the room, Priya Anand, who was 32 and had designed a significant portion of the platform's routing architecture, and Tom Selleck, which was genuinely his name, and a fact he had long since stopped commenting on, who managed the data integration systems. Both of them looked at Dean when he walked in, glanced at the gray uniform, and looked at Camille with questions they were too professional to ask out loud. "This is Dean Kessler," Camille said. "He's going to spend the morning looking at the error pattern. Give him whatever he asks for," Priya said, of course, in a tone that was perfectly courteous and almost entirely opaque. Tom said nothing, which was his way. Graham Sutter was not in the room. Camille had not told him about this meeting. She had spent the elevator ride up from B1 the previous evening going back and forth on that decision, and had landed on a position she couldn't fully articulate, except that it felt correct in the same way a wrong number feels wrong, before you've identified the error, something off in the frequency. Dean set his bag down at the conference table and looked at the room. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the monitors, at the printed logs, at the whiteboard along the left wall that was covered in the engineering team's previous 3 weeks of work. He walked to the whiteboard first, which nobody had expected, and stood in front of it for several minutes reading through what was there. He didn't touch it. He just read. "Can someone walk me through the timeline?" he said, without turning around. Not the technical detail, just the sequence. When the first deviation appeared, what changed in the week before it? Who was in what meetings? Marcus straightened in his chair. "That's not really a technical question." "No," Dean agreed. "It's not." Marcus looked at Camille. She gave him nothing. He sighed quietly and started talking. Dean listened to the timeline with the kind of attention that had a physical quality to it. You could feel it in the room, the way certain silences have weight. He asked 3 questions during Marcus's summary, none of which were about the code. He asked who had authorization to modify input parameters in the Halcyon feed. He asked whether that authorization had changed in the past 6 months. He asked who had been present at the system's first internal demonstration. Marcus answered the first 2 questions. On the third, he paused. The internal demonstration was restricted attendance. Senior leadership, the core engineering leads, the COO. Graham Sutter, Dean said. Yes. Was he in the room for the full demonstration or part of it? Marcus thought about it. He stepped out about 40 minutes in. He said he had another call. Dean turned from the whiteboard. He looked at Marcus steadily. Pull the access logs for the input parameter database for that afternoon. Specifically, any access occurring after he stepped out. The room was quiet in a new way. Priya looked at Tom. Tom looked at his coffee cup. Marcus looked at Camille, and in his face was the beginning of an expression she hadn't seen there before, not the measured concern of a methodical man noting a statistical anomaly, but something rawer, the look of someone whose understanding of a situation has just shifted under their feet like a floor that wasn't as solid as advertised. I'll pull them, Tom said. He said it quietly. The way you speak when you've already started putting something together and aren't sure you want to finish the thought. Dean went to the conference table and sat down. He opened his canvas bag and took out a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil. He picked up the first stack of printed error logs and began reading from the beginning. Nobody spoke. For the next 2 hours, Dean read. This was not a dramatic process. It looked from the outside like a man reading a stack of papers. He made occasional notes on the legal pad, not calculations. Camille noticed when she looked over his shoulder once. More like shorthand observations, symbols and abbreviated phrases that she couldn't parse. He went back through certain sections multiple times. He dog-eared pages without ceremony. At one point, he took 2 printed sheets and held them side by side for several minutes, looking between them, and then he set them down and wrote 3 words on his legal pad and circled them. Camille could not read what the words were from where she was standing. The engineering team gradually settled into their own work at the other end of the table, though they were not especially effective at it. Priya kept glancing at Dean. Tom had pulled the access logs Marcus requested and was going through them at his workstation with a stillness that suggested he had already found something he was deciding how to interpret. At 9:45, Dean set down the stack of logs and picked up his pencil. He turned to a fresh page of the legal pad and began writing. He wrote for about 8 minutes, sustained, focused, the pencil moving without pause, and then he put the pencil down and turned the legal pad so the writing faced outward. I need the whiteboard, he said. Marcus pointed to the eraser. I'm not erasing your team's work, Dean said. He looked around the room. Is there another board? Or can we get more paper? They found a roll of butcher paper in a supply closet down the hall. Tom taped 4 sheets across the wall beside the whiteboard. Dean stood up, picked up a marker, and for the next 40 minutes, he built something on that paper, not an argument, not a presentation, just the thing itself, laid out in the precise and unsentimental way of someone who is not trying to persuade anyone, but simply to show them what is there. He started with the chronology Marcus had given him and mapped the error occurrences not by type, as the engineering team had been organizing them, but by timing and by which specific input data clusters were affected. When he plotted them this way in simple horizontal columns, date on the left, affected cluster on the right, the pattern became visible in a way it hadn't been before. Not obvious. Not the kind of thing you'd see in 30 seconds. But there. The errors aren't random and they're not systemic, Dean said, still writing. They're periodic. Look at the spacing. He drew a vertical line between each cluster. The intervals weren't identical, but they were close enough, when you saw it laid out physically on paper, rather than in a digital interface, to stop looking like coincidence. Every occurrence lines up with a processing window that happens when the platform is running predictive modeling on its largest dataset. That's a window of approximately 4 minutes, every 48 to 72 hours, depending on server load. Priya had moved to stand next to Camille without noticing she'd done it. That window is when the system is least actively monitored, she said slowly. We're watching the outputs during test runs, but during the predictive modeling phase, the team usually steps back and lets it run. Right, Dean said. And during that window, something is slipping modified variables into the input feed, not replacing data modifying it. Small deviations well within the range the validation system accepts as normal variance. He drew a simple diagram. The platform processes the modified variables, produces a result that is technically valid according to everything it knows, and the result is fractionally wrong in a way that compounds over time. The room was very quiet. The system isn't broken, Marcus said. He said it the way you say something you already suspected was true but didn't want to be true. No, Dean said. The system is working perfectly. It's doing exactly what it was told to do. Tom spoke from his workstation without turning around. The access logs from the afternoon of the internal demonstration. His voice had the flat quality of someone keeping emotion out of a sentence that doesn't want to stay flat. There's a remote access event, 47 minutes after the start of the demonstration. It's logged under a service account, a maintenance account for the input parameter system, and the session lasted 6 minutes. Camille turned to look at him. Whose authorization was used to access that account? Tom finally turned around. The account belongs to IT infrastructure. But the access token, the credential that was used to open the session, it was generated from Graham Sutter's workstation. No one said anything for a long moment. Dean capped his marker. He set it up during the demonstration, Camille said. Not a question. While everyone else was watching the platform run, Dean said, when he stepped out, he had 47 minutes before anyone would notice he was gone. Long enough to establish the access point and set a schedule. He looked at Camille. He needed the errors to be subtle enough that your team would spend weeks looking in the wrong direction. If the platform had failed obviously, it would have been investigated quickly, and the source might have been found. This way, your engineers spend 3 weeks questioning the platform itself, the timeline closes in, and when the demonstration fails publicly. It looks like a leadership failure, Camille said. Not sabotage. The board removes you, Dean said. He steps in to stabilize the company. He's been positioning himself as the voice of contingency planning for weeks, so there's a narrative already in place. Camille thought about the briefing room. Graham at the far end of the table, impeccably calm, suggesting they prepare a communication strategy, just being thorough. She thought about how reasonable it had sounded, and how she had filed it away, and how the most dangerous lies were the ones that arrived dressed as practicality. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. I need everything Tom just found documented and preserved, she said. Her voice came out even, which cost her something. Server logs, access records, all of it copies secured off the main network immediately. Don't route anything through the standard system. She looked at Marcus. Nobody in this room talks about what we've found until I say otherwise. That includes immediate teams. Marcus nodded. He had gone slightly pale, but his hands were steady too. And the platform? Priya asked. We're 8 days out. Everyone looked at Dean. He was looking at the butcher paper diagram. The input modification is being introduced through the service account. If we isolate that account, verify and restore the compromised variables, and run a clean validation sequence, the platform should perform correctly. He paused. I'll need your full cooperation, and I'll need access to the input architecture, but I can walk your team through the restoration process. It's not complicated once you know what you're looking at. Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Camille. Then she looked back at Dean, and something in her face shifted, the particular shift that happens when a person's prior assumptions about another person simply run out of structural support and collapse quietly, making room for something more accurate. Okay, Priya said. Tell me what you need. The work took the rest of the day. It was not elegant. Dean and Priya argued twice, once about sequencing, once about how broadly to run the verification sweep, both times disagreements that were purely technical and resolved through evidence rather than rank, which was unusual enough in Camille's experience that she noted it. Tom worked with a focused grimness that she recognized as the manner of someone processing a betrayal at the same time as doing his job, parceling his reactions out carefully because the job required it. Marcus sat at the table and reviewed documents and called no one, which was a form of loyalty she would remember. Camille spent most of the day in the room, partly because she needed to be there, and partly because she couldn't have made herself leave. She worked on her own laptop, reviewed what documentation she could, answered a text from Graham about the demonstration prep with 3 calm sentences that cost her more composure than she showed, and periodically looked up to watch Dean work. He was patient in a way that was specific rather than general. He wasn't patient about everything. He was blunt when Priya's team made assumptions he thought were wrong, direct about what he needed, and when he needed it, entirely willing to say that's not the right approach without softening it. But he was patient about the pace of the work. He didn't push for faster when faster wasn't possible. He didn't perform urgency. He simply stayed present with whatever the current problem was, and when that problem was resolved, he moved to the next one. Late in the afternoon, during a 20-minute gap while the verification sweep was running, Camille found herself standing beside him at the window. The city below was doing what it always did, indifferent to everything happening on the 31st floor. "How did you know to look at the input feed first?" she asked. Dean was quiet for a moment. "In the field, when something goes wrong that your equipment says shouldn't be going wrong, you stop trusting the equipment and start asking who set the conditions." He watched a plane crossed the visible strip of sky between buildings. The platform was the equipment. The data feed was the conditions. Your team was trusting the equipment because the equipment had always been trustworthy. That's a reasonable assumption until it isn't. You didn't trust it. "I came in with no prior belief that the system was good," he said simply. "I had no investment in it being good. That's easier when you've never worked on it." She considered this. Do they teach you that in the military? They teach you to separate what you know from what you want to be true, he said. It sounds simple. It's actually the hardest thing there is. She thought about that for a while. She thought about it in the context of Graham Sutter, and in the context of Ruby, and in the context of herself sitting in an elevator 3 weeks ago, feeling certain she had made the correct decision, and she didn't say any of those things out loud because the moment didn't require them. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, "and I want you to understand that it's not a condition of anything, not the platform work, not Ruby's lessons. It's just a question." He looked at her. "Oh, why this job?" She kept her voice neutral. "You turned down work that would have paid you 4 or 5 times what you make here. You're clearly," she paused, picking the word carefully. "You have skills that would be valued very differently in other places. Why night maintenance?" He took a moment with the question. Not a defensive moment she could see. He was actually thinking about how to answer it honestly rather than well. When Caleb was 2, he said, "I was still taking short-term consulting work. Mostly risk assessment, some logistics analysis. Good pay, inconsistent hours. One morning I got back from a 3-day assignment and he'd learned to climb out of his crib while I was gone." He paused. "My mother told me. She'd been staying with him. She said he'd been doing it since the second night. And every time he climbed out, he'd go stand in the doorway of my room and just stand there for a while, and then climb back in." He looked back at the window. "I took the night job 2 months later. The pay is what it is. But I'm there every morning." Camille said nothing. She wasn't sure there was anything useful to say, and she had gotten enough experience in her life with the damage caused by filling silences that didn't need filling. After a moment, Dean said, "You asked about my job. Can I ask about yours? Go ahead. What time do you get home at night?" She felt the question land. She didn't answer immediately. "It varies," she said finally. Sure, he said in a tone that was not unkind. Priya called from across the room that the verification sweep was complete, and they both turned back to the work, and neither of them said anything more about it. But Camille carried the question home with her that evening, sitting in the back of the car while the city moved past the windows, and it sat with her through dinner, and through the hours she spent at Ruby's bedroom door listening to her daughter explain cryptography with patient, careful precision. And it was still there when she turned off her own light at midnight and lay in the dark thinking about a small boy standing in a doorway. She called her lawyer at 8 the next morning. She did this from her personal cell, not her office line, and she did it before she entered the Nexora building. I need to understand what documentation I need to trigger a formal board investigation into a senior executive, she said. And I need to understand the legal exposure if we're wrong. Her lawyer, who had been with her for 11 years and had heard a great many unusual opening statements, said, "Tell me what you have," she told him. It took 12 minutes. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The access logs alone won't be enough if he has a competent defense. You need the full digital chain, the service account session, the credential source, the pattern of modifications over time, and ideally something that connects his motive to the timing. His motive is documented in internal email, she said. He sent a message to 2 board members 8 months ago, suggesting that Nexora's current leadership structure was creating strategic vulnerability. He framed it as governance concern, but read alongside everything else. "Forward me everything you have," he said. "I'll tell you where we stand by noon." She pocketed her phone and walked into the building. In the elevator, she checked her messages. Graham had sent a note at 7:50 asking about the demonstration rehearsal scheduled for later in the week. The message was measured and professional and entirely characteristic of him, and she read it twice with the specific feeling of looking at a surface that had always looked like solid ground. She replied that she'd confirm the schedule by end of day. She sent the message and watched the floors climb. The call from her lawyer came at 11:47. "You have enough," he said. "Enough to take to the board, enough to justify a formal investigation, and enough that any reasonable outside counsel will tell him the same thing when he retains them. The access logs are clean, the chain of custody is intact, the credential source is unambiguous. Combined with the pattern analysis and the motive documentation, this holds. What's the risk to Nexora if we go public before the demonstration? Reputational risk, yes, but less than if you're seen to have delayed disclosure. Move before the demonstration, present it as evidence of strong governance response, and the story is that Nexora caught internal misconduct and handled it proactively." He paused. "Move after a failed demonstration, and the story is whatever he and his attorneys make it." "I'm not planning to fail the demonstration," she said. "Then move now," he said, "or at the latest the morning of." She thanked him and ended the call. She sat for a moment at her desk, looking at the city, which had nothing to tell her and never did. Then she picked up her phone and sent Dean a message on the secure channel they'd established 2 days earlier through Marcus. "Platform restoration, where are we?" His reply came back in under a minute. "Verification complete. Clean variables confirmed. Ran a simulation last night after your team left. It held. Priya has the documentation. We're good to demonstrate." Camille exhaled. She held on to that for approximately 4 seconds. Then she pulled up her calendar and started building what the next 8 days were going to look like, because the platform problem was solved and the Graham problem was not yet solved, and the demonstration was in 8 days, and there was no version of this that happened without her being in every room where it mattered. That evening she got home at 7:15, which was early by her recent standards, and which she was aware was still later than she wanted it to be. Ruby was at the kitchen table doing homework that was not sufficiently challenging and not pretending otherwise. She had a book open beside the worksheet that was clearly more interesting to her than the worksheet. "Mr. Dean says the lessons can start again," Camille said, without preamble. Ruby looked up. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons," Camille said. "Here at home, not in the building. And I want to meet his son." Ruby was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did he fix it, the platform thing?" "He did." Ruby looked at her worksheet. Then she said quietly, the way she said things she'd been sitting with for a while, "I knew he would." Camille pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I know," she said. "You were right." Ruby looked at her, then really looked at her, the way she sometimes did when she was checking something and wanted to see if it was actually true or just being said. Whatever she found in her mother's face seemed to satisfy her, because after a moment she went back to her book, which was about cryptography, and which she was reading with the particular focused contentment of someone who has been given back something they were missing. Camille sat at the table and opened her own work and did not immediately start on it, because she was sitting at the kitchen table at 7:15 with her daughter, and for a moment she simply let that be a complete thing. 6 days before the demonstration, Graham sent a memo to the full senior leadership team proposing a contingency framework for managing stakeholder communication in the event of a technical delay. It was written in the measured, responsible language of executive prudence. It proposed specific protocols. It named specific people, not Camille directly, but arranged things in a way that would systematically remove her from the primary communication loop if the demonstration was declared compromised. Camille read the memo 3 times. She forwarded it to her lawyer with a single line, adding this to the record. She sent Graham a reply praising the thoroughness of his preparation. Then she went back to work. She was not someone who had ever done her best thinking in crisis. Her real skill had always been in the middle distances, the sustained, grinding strategic attention that most people found exhausting, and she found clarifying. She knew how to hold multiple timelines in her head simultaneously. She knew how to move pieces across a board while appearing to be focused on only one. She was moving pieces now. She did not know yet exactly how the morning of the demonstration would unfold. She did not know whether Graham had realized his access had been detected, or whether he believed his architecture was still hidden, or whether in this she considered more carefully he was so confident in the design of it that he wasn't looking for evidence of discovery at all. Overconfidence was its own kind of blind spot. She'd seen it before. What she knew was this: the platform was restored, the documentation was secured, the legal position was established, and the only thing remaining was the moment itself. The room, the morning, the choice of when and how. She thought about what Dean had said about the platform and about trust and about the difference between what you know and what you want to be true. She thought about a man who had spent a decade knowing exactly how to find the source of a problem by asking who had set the starting conditions. She thought about the demonstration room and the screen behind the podium, and the government representatives and executives and board members who would be in their seats 8 days from now, expecting either a triumph or a collapse. She thought about Graham Sutter, impeccable and prepared, waiting for her to stand at that podium and not know what he knew. She turned off her office light and took the elevator down. In the lobby, the cleaning crew was beginning their evening shift, and somewhere in the building, Dean Kessler was starting his night, the same way he started every night, without announcement, without audience, doing the work that needed doing, because it needed doing. Camille walked out into the city. 8 days. The Tuesday before the demonstration, Dean started the lessons again. He came to the house at 4 in the afternoon, which Camille had arranged with some logistical effort. Her schedule did not naturally accommodate 4 o'clock anything, and he brought Caleb because she had asked to meet his son, and because, as Dean had explained briefly over text, Caleb went where Dean went on afternoons when school let out early. This was stated as simple fact rather than apology, and Camille had taken it as such. Caleb was 10 years old and built like a smaller version of his father, same broad shoulders starting to emerge, same quality of stillness that read as thought rather than passivity. He had his father's eyes and a habit of looking at things carefully before he touched them, which Ruby seemed to find immediately interesting. The two of them sized each other up in the entryway for approximately 30 seconds, Ruby from the 3rd step of the staircase, Caleb from just inside the front door, and then Ruby said, "Do you know what a cipher is?" And Caleb said, "Like a code," and Ruby said, "Come on," and they went upstairs without further ceremony. Dean watched them go. "She doesn't do that," Camille said. "Usually. With people she doesn't know." "Caleb doesn't either," Dean said. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed like a man who had watched his son navigate the world long enough to know when something was going to be fine and when it wasn't, and had learned to trust the distinction. They set up at the kitchen table. Dean had brought a canvas bag with some materials, graph paper, a set of colored markers, 3 small objects that turned out to be a gyroscope, a level, and a small mirror, the purpose of which Camille did not initially understand. He started with a problem that looked simple and wasn't, which was apparently his standard approach. And from upstairs, they could hear Ruby explaining something to Caleb in the focused, slightly impatient tone she used when she thought someone could keep up, but wasn't sure yet. Camille sat at the far end of the table with her laptop, meaning to work. She did not work very much. She watched instead, quietly, the way you watch something you've been told about, and are now finally seeing for yourself. The lesson was not what she'd expected. It was less formal, for one thing. Dean didn't follow a sequence so much as follow Ruby. He'd give her a problem, watch how she approached it, and then take her approach and extend it somewhere she hadn't expected. When she got frustrated, which happened twice, he didn't back off the problem or reassure her. He said, "Stay with it. What do you actually know right now? That's definitely true," and waited while she worked back down to the bedrock and started again. The second time she got frustrated, she said, "With some heat, I hate this problem." And Dean said, without looking up from what he was writing, "Good." Hate usually means you care enough to keep going, and Ruby made a sound that was mostly irritation and partly, reluctantly, amusement, and kept going. At one point, Caleb came downstairs to get water and lingered at the edge of the kitchen, watching the problem Ruby was working through. After a moment, he said, "Isn't that just like what we did with the river mapping thing, Dad?" And Dean looked up and said, "Yeah. You want to show her?" And Caleb sat down and spent 7 minutes explaining to Ruby a technique Dean had apparently taught him for visualizing directional probability, which Ruby followed with the intensity of someone memorizing something they intend to keep, and then they went back upstairs and continued whatever they'd been doing. Camille looked at Dean after they left. "He's good at that," she said, explaining things. "He's better than me at it, actually," Dean said. "He'll slow down further. I get impatient." He said it without false modesty, just observed it. He got that from his grandmother. "Your mother?" "She spent 30 years as a cafeteria worker and could explain anything to anyone," he said. "She used to say patience wasn't a virtue. It was a technique." I think she was right. Camille thought about that. She thought about her own mother, who had been a corporate attorney and whose primary technique had been precision accurate, fast, unsparing, and who had passed those qualities to her daughter, along with a quiet assumption that moving faster was always preferable to waiting longer. She was less sure of that now than she had been a month ago. "Dean," she said. She hadn't used his first name before. He noticed she saw it, but didn't comment. "The morning of the demonstration. I need to talk through what I'm planning." He set his marker down, she told him. All of it, the legal documentation, her lawyer's assessment, the plan to present the board with the evidence against Graham on the morning of the demonstration itself, before the event began. She told him about the memo Graham had sent, the contingency framework, the way it was designed to siphon control from her hands in the event of failure. She told him she intended to remove that option entirely by ensuring the failure never happened, and the saboteurs was named before anyone took their seats. Dean listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What happens if Graham figures out before the demonstration that you know? Then he'll either run or he'll lawyer up immediately. Either way, the board investigation proceeds." She had thought about this, but I don't think he knows. He's been communicating normally. The platform errors stopped when we cleaned the input feed, but he'd expect that to look like a coincidence, the team finally finding a bug they'd been missing. There's nothing to tell him we found the actual source. "Assuming he hasn't put something else in place," Dean said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone who planned this carefully for 8 months didn't plan a single point of failure." He said it without drama, the way he said most things. "If the input modification gets discovered, does he have another layer? Something that still puts the demonstration at risk even with the platform restored." Camille sat with that. She had not thought about a second layer. She had found the mechanism, secured the evidence, restored the system, and allowed herself to believe the threat was contained. That was the assumption she'd been operating from for 6 days. She pulled up her laptop. "What would it look like?" she said. "A second layer. Depends how he thinks. His primary goal is making the demonstration fail publicly. He doesn't necessarily need the platform to fail. He just needs the demonstration to fail." Dean picked up the gyroscope from the table and turned it in his hand, not playing with it. She could see, just thinking with it, the way some people needed something in their hands to think clearly. Who controls the physical environment on the day? The room setup, the AV, the network connection the platform runs through during the live demo. Camille looked at him. "Facilities and AV are managed through building operations," she said, "which reports to..." She stopped. "The COO. Not directly, there were 2 layers of department management between Graham and the AV team, but the operational chain ran through him. Had always run through him. It was one of the structural decisions she'd made when she hired him, giving him operational breadth, because his management background warranted it. She opened a new message window and wrote to Marcus, "Need you to run a check on the AV and network configuration for the demonstration room. Physical setup, connection routing, Anything that was modified or serviced in the last 2 weeks. Tonight, if possible. She sent it and looked at Dean. Good catch, she said. Might be nothing, he said, but it might not be. Right, he said. He set the gyroscope down. You said the board presentation happens before the demonstration starts. Who's in the room for that? Board members only. 6 people. Not Graham. Not Graham. Does he know he's not invited to a pre-demonstration board session? He knows there's a session. He doesn't know the subject. Dean considered. What does he think the morning looks like? He thinks there's a pre-demonstration leadership briefing at 8. Demonstration at 10. He's expecting to be in both. She paused. I told him the briefing was pushed to 9:15 due to a scheduling conflict with one of the government representatives. Dean looked at her. Something in his face, not quite approval, not quite surprise, something between them. That buys you time. About an hour and 15 minutes, she said. Enough to get through the board presentation, secure his access credentials, and have someone from HR and legal present when he's informed. Dean nodded slowly. He turned the gyroscope once more and set it precisely back on the table. You've thought this through. I've had 8 days, she said, and I've made enough expensive mistakes in my life to know that the one you really can't recover from is the one you didn't see coming, because you stopped looking. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her laptop, because the moment had said what it needed to say, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with the rest of it. Marcus's response came back at 10:40 that night. He had found something. The network routing for the demonstration room had been reconfigured 5 days ago, 3 days after Dean and Priya had cleaned the Halcyon input feed. The reconfiguration was logged under a routine maintenance ticket. The ticket had been approved through the facility's management chain. But the specific technical instruction, the one that changed which network path the demonstration room's system connection would route through, had originated from a configuration file that was modified from a workstation. Registered to Graham Sutter's executive assistant. The assistant, Marcus noted, had been on approved leave for the past 2 weeks. Her workstation had been accessed twice during her absence. The reconfiguration routed the demonstration room's live system connection through a secondary network path that ran through a server cluster Graham's division managed. It was subtle enough to pass a casual check. During the live demonstration, with the platform running on that routing, any signal interruption to that server cluster would break the live connection mid-presentation. The platform itself would be functional. The demonstration would still fail. Camille read the message standing in her kitchen at 10:40 at night, still in work clothes because she hadn't gotten around to changing, with the house quiet around her and Ruby long since asleep. She forwarded it to Dean with 3 words, second layer confirmed. His reply came back in 4 minutes. Can Priya reroute back to primary before morning without triggering the facilities system? She forwarded that to Marcus, who was apparently also still awake. Marcus, yes, 2 hours of work. Tonight, I'll go in. Camille, take Tom with you. Document everything. Then she sent one more message, this one to her lawyer. We have a second point of interference. I'm adding it to the documentation package. I need you available at 7 tomorrow morning. She put her phone down on the kitchen counter. She stood there for a moment in the quiet. The house made its small night noises, the refrigerator, the settling of walls, the distant sound of traffic. Through the kitchen window, the city was doing its usual thing, indifferent and lit. She thought about Graham Sutter at his desk somewhere, or at home, living inside the belief that everything was still running to plan. She thought about the particular kind of arrogance required to engineer someone else's professional destruction from the inside and feel nothing about it except tactical satisfaction. She had known people like that. She had worked beside them, competed against them, occasionally beaten them, and occasionally lost to them, and she had never quite been able to fully understand the architecture of a mind that reduced other people to obstacles. She had also, she admitted to herself in the quiet of her kitchen, hired one. That was hers to carry. She knew it. She would carry it carefully and learn from it, and not let it make her either reckless in the future or falsely cautious, because both were the wrong response to being wrong once, or twice, or however many times it had taken her to get here. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. She paused at Ruby's door, which was open 2 inches the way it always was at night. Ruby was asleep with her arm over a book she'd fallen asleep reading, which happened regularly. Camille went in and moved the book and pulled the blanket up, and stood there for a moment in the dark that was not quite dark, lit by the soft orange light coming through the window from the city below. Ruby's face in sleep was still and unguarded in the way children's faces are, without the effort and watchfulness that appeared during waking hours. She looked, Camille thought, like a person who was in the middle of working something out there, was a quality even to her stillness that suggested ongoing activity, the impression of a mind that didn't really stop. Camille was aware that she had not known this about her daughter until recently. She had known Ruby was intelligent. She had known she was quiet and guarded and had been hurting in a way that wasn't dramatic enough to look like crisis but was real. She had provided for those things in the ways she knew how to provide. She had not known that Ruby needed someone to give her a harder problem and wait and believe she could solve it. She had not known because she had not been present enough or patient enough or possibly just there enough to find out. That was also hers to carry. She was getting better at picking things up. She went to bed and set her alarm for 5:30. The morning of the demonstration was overcast. The sky, the particular flat gray of a city autumn that couldn't decide whether to commit to rain. Camille was in the building at 6:45, which was earlier than anyone except the cleaning crew and the security desk, and she found that the cleaning crew was finishing the executive floors, and the corridors smelled of the industrial cleaners she would always, from now on, associate with a particular basement break room, and a particular conversation that had changed more things than she'd fully tallied yet. Dean was not working that morning. His shift had ended at 2. She had sent him a message the previous evening. "You don't need to come in tomorrow. We have it from here." His reply had been, "I know. Good luck." She had stared at that for a moment, and then put her phone down and gone back to her preparation notes. By 7:15, her lawyer was in her office. By 7:40, 2 members of Nexora's board had arrived. She had called them personally the previous evening, told them only that there was a matter requiring their attention before the demonstration, and that their presence at 7:40 was essential. They had both come. Eleanor Vance, who had been on the board for 11 years, and who Camille had always found genuinely difficult to read, and Robert Arriaga, who was a former federal prosecutor, and who, when Camille laid the documentation on the table in front of him, put on his reading glasses and went through it with a methodical, deliberate attention that reminded her briefly of Dean reading the error logs. The other 4 board members arrived between 7:40 and 8:10. The last one, Patricia Sung, apologized for being 3 minutes late and then looked at the documents already distributed around the table and said, "This is not a pre-demonstration logistics briefing, is it?" And Camille said, "No." And Patricia Sung sat down and said, "All right, let's hear it." Camille stood at the head of the table and presented the case in 40 minutes. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered, not with the expectation of perfection, but with the thoroughness that came from knowing the cost of gaps. She walked them through the timeline, the access logs, the credential chain, the pattern analysis, the secondary network reconfiguration, and the documentation of Graham's internal communications, establishing both motive and methodology. She presented the legal counsel's assessment. She answered questions. Robert Arriaga had several. Eleanor Vance had 2 that were shorter and sharper, and she did not editorialize, did not make it personal, did not try to manage anyone's emotional response to what they were hearing. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Eleanor Vance said, "How confident are you in the source attribution on the access logs?" "The credential chain is clean," Camille said. "My legal team has reviewed it. The IT forensics documentation is in the appendix." Arriaga said, "The secondary network reconfiguration that was corrected last night, corrected and documented." Marcus Chen and Tom Selleck completed the rerouting at 1:15 this morning. "The demonstration room is running on primary network connection as of this moment." Arriaga looked at the documentation for another moment. Then he took off his reading glasses and said, "I'd like to know how you found the input modification. Your engineering team had been looking for weeks." Camille paused 1 beat. "I brought in an outside perspective. Someone with a background in pattern analysis who had no prior assumptions about the platform." "Who?" "Dean Kessler. He's on Nexora's maintenance staff." She said it plainly, without apology, without framing. He identified the upstream data interference within a day of being brought in to look at it. Arriaga looked at her for a moment. "Maintenance staff. Yes." Another moment. He put his glasses back on and made a note on the document in front of him. "All right," he said. Patricia Sung said, "What do you need from us this morning?" "Authorization to suspend Graham Sutter's access credentials and executive authority effective immediately, pending the outcome of an independent investigation. HR and legal are prepared to inform him at 9 o'clock. She paused. I also need the board's confidence that today's demonstration proceeds as scheduled. The platform is functioning correctly. I want to demonstrate it. Eleanor Vance looked around the table. Nobody spoke against it. You have it, Eleanor said. At 8:57, Camille's phone showed a message from her head of HR. Done. He's been informed. His access has been suspended. He's left the building. She read the message in the hallway outside the demonstration auditorium, where the government procurement team was already gathering in the lobby, and her communications director was managing logistics with the competent, slightly frantic energy of someone who had been told half the story and was doing their best with it. She stood there for a moment. The thing about a plan that works is that it doesn't feel like a triumph immediately afterward. It feels mostly like a cessation of tension, the particular physical relief of a knot coming undone, followed fairly quickly by awareness of how tired you actually are. She was tired. She had been running on preparation and controlled adrenaline for 8 days, and she was going to feel all of it later, probably at an inconvenient time. But right now she had about 40 minutes. She took out her phone and sent a message. Graham's gone. Platform is green. Demonstration starts in 40 minutes. You should be here. The reply came back in 2 minutes. I work nights. I'm asleep. She stared at that, and then, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, she laughed. A real one, short and sudden, and slightly startled, the kind that doesn't give you time to decide whether to have it. She wrote back, wake up. Bring Caleb. There's something Ruby wants to show him. 3 minutes passed. Then give me 20 minutes. He arrived at 9:41, which was 19 minutes later, wearing a clean flannel shirt and dark jeans and looking like a man who had showered in a hurry but had otherwise declined to be flustered by the request. Caleb was beside him in a sweatshirt that said something about a school robotics team, his hair not entirely flat, squinting slightly in the way of someone still adjusting to being awake. Ruby was already inside the auditorium she'd arrived with Mrs. Hong at 9:30, at Camille's specific request, on grounds she hadn't fully explained to either Ruby or Mrs. Huang. When she saw Dean and Caleb come through the lobby doors, Ruby came out from the auditorium, took one look at Caleb's sweatshirt and said, "Robotics? What level?" And Caleb said, "We went to regionals last year." And Ruby said, "Okay, that's actually impressive," in a tone that made clear she was not in the habit of giving that particular concession easily. They went inside together. Dean stopped beside Camille in the lobby. He looked at her for a moment, the whole situation. Her, the building full of government representatives and executives and board members, the demonstration setup, visible through the auditorium doors. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," she said. "Thank you for coming." He looked toward the auditorium.
Ruby doing okay?
"She's fine. She's been interrogating Caleb about his robotics program for 3 minutes." She paused. She actually smiled, which she hasn't done in a meeting-adjacent environment since she was 6, and found a dog in this lobby. Something in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. "That sounds about right. Dean." She said his name and then took a moment because what she wanted to say was several things at once, and she had not had time to work out how to say them in a way that was honest without being performed. "I want you in the auditorium. Not in the back. I want you seated up front near the stage." He looked at her. "There are going to be 140 people in that room," she said. "Government officials, board members, senior staff, investors. They're all going to watch a platform work that you fixed, using an analysis nobody else in this building could produce. And I want you where I can see you when I speak about what happened." She paused. "That's not negotiable." A long moment. "I'm wearing a flannel shirt," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I don't care." He looked at the auditorium doors. He looked at Camille. He had the expression of a man running a brief private calculation and arriving at a result he hadn't entirely planned for. "Okay," he said. The auditorium filled up fast. By 9:50, every seat was taken. The government procurement team was arranged in the front center block, 7 officials, led by a deputy director named Harlan Price, who had the posture of a man who had sat through many demonstrations and would require actual evidence before he was impressed by anything. The Nexora board was to one side. Senior engineering staff and department heads filled the middle rows. In the front row, off to the left, Ruby sat between Dean and Caleb. She had a notebook on her knee. She was not using it yet. She was watching the stage with the full, unguarded attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. Camille stood backstage for 2 minutes. She had a habit, before important presentations, of 2 minutes of silence where she didn't review notes or think about logistics, but just stood still. She had developed it in her early 30s after a disastrous investor presentation where she had been so overprepared and overstimulated that she'd started talking before she'd actually decided what she wanted to say. 2 minutes, just to be where she was. She walked out onto the stage at 10 o'clock precisely. The room settled. She went to the microphone. She looked out at the room, the government officials, the board, the engineering team, the executives, the faces of people who had various degrees of knowledge about what the last 3 weeks had contained, and none of them the full picture. She looked briefly at the front row. Ruby was watching her with the same complete attention she gave to hard problems. Caleb was sitting with his hands on his knees, upright. Dean was looking at the stage with an expression she could not read from this distance, which was characteristic, and which she had stopped finding impenetrable and started finding simply honest. The face of someone who was there because they'd chosen to be there and had no other performance to give. She began. She did not begin with the platform. She did not begin with the technical specifications or the government contract timeline or the capabilities overview that had been in the original presentation deck. She set the deck aside. She said, "Before we begin, I want to speak to you briefly about how we got here." The room adjusted its attention. 3 weeks ago, Nexora's most important platform began producing errors that our engineering team couldn't identify. We had 200 engineers working in shifts around the clock. We had access to every diagnostic tool we owned. We found nothing. She paused. Then I brought in someone to look at it differently. She looked at the front row. The person who identified the source of the problem, who traced an act of deliberate internal sabotage that every technical expert on our staff had missed, and who developed the framework for restoring the platform's integrity, is sitting in the front row of this auditorium. She paused. His name is Dean Kessler. He has worked at Nexora for 14 months. His job title is night maintenance. A ripple through the room. Heads turning. The particular sound of a large group of people recalibrating. "I'm telling you this," Camille said, "because I think it's important that the people in this room understand something about how this company intends to operate going forward. We had the answer to our problem in this building for months. The reason it took us 3 weeks to access it has nothing to do with the quality of the answer and everything to do with the quality of our assumptions about where answers come from." She held the room. "That's on me, and I don't intend to repeat it." Harlan Price in the front center block had stopped looking, prepared to be unimpressed. He was listening. She turned to the screen. Now she said, "Let me show you what Halcyon can do." She nodded to Marcus in the control booth. The platform came up on the screen behind her, clean, green, fully operational. The routing architecture spreading across the display like a city scene from above, every node lit and connected. She walked through the live demonstration the way she had rehearsed it, section by section, the platform performing each function with the unhesitating accuracy of a system that had been correctly restored and correctly built and was now doing exactly what it had always been capable of doing. 30 minutes is in. Harlan Price leaned over to say something to the official beside him. 40 minutes in, one of his team members had a tablet out and was taking notes. At the 50-minute mark, when the final simulation ran a complex multivariable logistics routing problem involving 47 simultaneous supply chains, which the platform resolved in 11 seconds, the response from the room was not applause immediately. It was, first, a moment of quiet. The specific quiet of a room full of people looking at something and deciding whether what they're seeing is what they think they're seeing. Then Harlan Price said, "Run it again." Marcus ran it again. The platform resolved it in 9 seconds the second time. The variation was within normal parameters. Harlan Price sat back in his chair. Then the room gave them the applause. Camille stood at the podium and let it run for a moment. She looked at the front row. Ruby had both hands pressed flat on her notebook and was looking at the platform to display with an expression of pure, clean satisfaction that Camille wanted to keep somewhere she could find it later. Caleb was clapping. Dean was not clapping. He was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the screen, and his expression was the one he wore when a problem had resolved correctly, and that was simply what the data showed. Camille stepped back to the microphone. "I have one more thing to address before we open the floor," she said. "This morning, Nexora's board of directors authorized the suspension and formal investigation of our chief operating officer, Graham Sutter, on documented evidence of deliberate interference with this platform's development. The board's decision and the evidentiary basis for it will be communicated formally through appropriate channels." I'm noting it here because transparency is not optional for this company, and because the people in this room deserve to understand what we found and how we found it. She paused. The investigation is independent. The platform you just saw demonstrated is clean. Nexora is proceeding. Another moment of quiet, different in character from the first. Heavier. More complicated. Harlan Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Ms. Westbrook will want a full technical briefing from your engineering team after the break. Of course, she said. Marcus Chin will lead it. He'll have everything you need. She stepped back from the podium. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had been elevated for most of the morning, and was beginning to acknowledge that the most acute phase of the crisis had passed. Not the aftermath, there would be weeks of aftermath. Investigations and communications and structural rebuilding and all the unglamorous work of repair. But the moment itself, the one that had required her to be most precisely herself, was done. She walked off the stage. In the corridor backstage, she sat down on a folding chair that someone had left against the wall and put her hands on her knees and breathed for a moment. Her communications director appeared briefly to tell her Harlan Price's aide was asking about the afternoon schedule, and she said, "Tell Marcus. I need 5 minutes," and the director disappeared. She sat on the folding chair. She realized enormously tired. And something that wasn't relief exactly, because relief implied the removal of something bad, and this was larger than that. It was more like the feeling of having arrived somewhere she'd been traveling toward for a long time, without fully knowing the destination, which was not a comfortable feeling in the moment. It required you to look around at where you'd landed and decide what to do next without the forward momentum of the crisis to carry you. She got up after 4 minutes, which was 1 minute short of what she'd asked for, and went back out. The corridor opened back into the lobby, and across the lobby she could see through the auditorium's glass wall. The networking break was underway. People standing in clusters with coffee, the energy of the room lighter than it had been 2 hours ago. She could see Marcus with Harlan Price's team. She could see board members in conversation. She could see, in the front corner of the room, Ruby and Caleb standing by the window with Ruby's notebook open between them, and Ruby was pointing at something she'd written, talking quickly, and Caleb was following with his head, tilted slightly the way his father's tilted when he was thinking. Dean was beside them, leaning against the wall with his arms still crossed, watching his son, and this girl he'd spent 4 months teaching in a basement break room. His face had the expression she associated now with his particular form of contentment, not happiness as a performance, not satisfaction as an achievement, just the settled quality of a person who is exactly where they intended to be. Camille stood in the lobby doorway and watched the three of them. She thought about the report she had read 8 weeks ago. The 41 pages. The man who had turned down money and prestige and the recognition of his own abilities to be home in the morning. The boy who had climbed out of his crib and stood in a doorway. The 2 years of consulting work, the adjunct semester, the $22 an hour, and Dean Kessler making every single one of those choices with the clear eyes of someone who understood what he was trading and had decided the trade was correct. She had spent years believing that the people who succeeded were the ones who pushed hardest in the direction of more recognition, more resources, more leverage, more control. She had built Nexora on that belief, and it was not entirely wrong. But she was standing in a lobby looking at a man who had built something different with as much deliberateness as she'd built her company. And what he'd built was smaller and quieter and required you to give up a great deal. And it had a 10-year-old boy in it who could teach a lesson to a stranger's daughter without being asked. There were things money could construct and things it couldn't. She had known that intellectually for a long time. She was only now beginning to know it the other way. She straightened up and went back into the room because there was still work to do, and she had learned, from a man who mopped floors after midnight and taught mathematics with coins and paper cups, that the work in front of you was usually the most important place to be. The weeks after the demonstration were not clean or simple, and Camille would have been suspicious of them if they had been. The Graham-Sutter investigation moved the way formal investigations moved methodically, with legal counsel on multiple sides, with documentation requests and depositions, and the particular grinding tedium of institutional process doing what institutional process is designed to do. Graham had retained an attorney within hours of being informed of his suspension, which was his right and which Camille had expected. The attorney was good. Graham was better prepared than she'd anticipated, which she filed away as a lesson about underestimating people you think you've already understood. But the evidence was what it was. The credential chain, the access logs, the network reconfiguration, the 8 months of internal communications that, read in sequence, told a story that no competent defense could fully reframe. The independent investigator the board retained was a former federal auditor named Solis, who had, according to Robert Arriaga, the personality of a spreadsheet and the instincts of a bloodhound, which turned out to be an accurate description. Solis spent 3 weeks going through Nexora's systems with a thoroughness that made even Marcus slightly nervous, and at the end of it delivered a report that was 112 pages long and left very little room for interpretation. Graham Sutter's employment was formally terminated 6 weeks after the demonstration. There were conversations with federal authorities about the nature of the interference, given the government contract involved. Camille's lawyer managed that process. She stayed out of the details where she could, and in them where she had to be, and she did not enjoy any part of it, which she thought was probably the correct response. What she did instead, in the spaces between the legal process, was think about what came next. She had a company to restructure the COO position needed to be filled or redistributed. Several operational systems that had run through Graham's division needed to be audited for integrity, and the internal culture of Nexora needed something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Not a reset, more like a recalibration. A deliberate examination of what the organization had been rewarding and what it had been overlooking, and whether those two things were actually aligned with what she wanted Nexora to be. She started that examination the only way she knew how, by asking questions and listening to the answers, without deciding in advance what she wanted them to be. She talked to engineers and accountants and security staff and administrative assistants, and, one afternoon, to the woman who managed the overnight cleaning crew, a 58-year-old named Dolores who had worked in the building for 9 years, and who, when Camille asked her what she thought the company could do better, looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to take a question seriously or dismiss it as performance. Dolores took it seriously. "The people who keep this building running after hours," she said, "we don't exist to anyone during the day. Not in a mean way. Just we're not there. We don't have names, mostly. We fix what's broken and nobody thinks about how it got fixed." She paused. "That's fine. That's the job. But if you're asking what could be different," she looked around the corridor they were standing in, clean and polished and lit by lights that someone had changed and someone had dusted. "It would be nice if the people making decisions knew something about the people they're deciding for." Camille thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it 3 weeks later, when Dean came to the house on a Thursday afternoon for Ruby's lesson, and she told him she wanted to talk after. Ruby and Caleb had developed a dynamic by now that Camille found alternately charming and slightly alarming. Ruby was the one with the more formal mathematical foundation. Her intuition was extraordinary, and she had been absorbing everything. Dean taught her with an efficiency that he had mentioned, in his understated way, was not something I've seen before in a kid her age. Caleb was more methodical, more patient, and had a gift for explanation that his father had noted accurately. He could take something complex and find the angle that made it accessible without making it smaller, which was rarer than it sounded. What this meant in practice was that the two of them were teaching each other, at least as much as Dean was teaching either of them, and that the lessons had developed into a three-way conversation that moved faster and went further than Dean had originally planned for, which he seemed to regard with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly predicted an outcome without wanting to say so. That Thursday, while Ruby and Caleb were upstairs working through a problem, Dean had set them a probability puzzle involving navigation and incomplete information, which he'd adapted from an actual operational problem he'd worked through years ago, stripped of any classified context and reframed as a question about ships and weather. Camille made coffees and sat across the kitchen table from Dean and said, "I have an idea I want to run by you." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "Okay. There's a floor in the Nexora building that's been unused for 8 months, she said. We had plans for it a client hospitality suite, which we've since decided not to build. It's about 4,000 square feet. Good light. It's above the engineering floors but below the executive level." Dean looked at her. "I want to turn it into a learning space," she said, "for employees' children. Free, no grades, no formal curriculum, no application process. Children of people who work at Nexora any level, any department can come after school and on Saturdays. We'd bring in staff volunteers to teach whatever they know." engineers teaching coding and applied math, accountants teaching how money actually works, designers teaching spatial reasoning, security staff teaching situational awareness and logic. She paused. And I want you to design the program. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the wet street. Dean said, I mop floors. You also identified an act of corporate sabotage that 31 engineers missed, taught my daughter more mathematics in 4 months than 2 years of enrichment programs managed, and apparently restructured your entire professional life around what you actually believe is important. She met his eyes. I'm asking you to design a learning program, not manage a company. I think you know how to do that. He looked at his coffee. He turned the mug once. What would I call it? I don't know. That's your call. He was quiet for a moment. What's the budget? Tell me what you need. That's not an answer. I know, she said. Tell me what you need, and I'll tell you if it's workable. He looked at the table. She could see him thinking, not performing consideration, actually working through something. The space needs to be set up so kids don't know whose parents are executives and whose parents are maintenance workers, he said. Same chairs, same tables, no visible hierarchy in the room. If a kid can walk in and look around and tell immediately whether they belong with the high-status group or the low-status group, the whole thing fails before it starts. Agreed. Volunteers who come to teach can't treat it like charity work. They have to treat it like sharing something they actually know, not performing generosity. If it becomes a feel-good exercise for executives, the kids will feel it and check out. How do you prevent that? You design the teaching structure so the volunteer is learning too, he said. Put an accountant in a room trying to explain compound interest to a 10-year-old who won't accept an answer that doesn't make sense to them. And the accountant is going to have to think harder than they have in years. That's not a bad thing. He paused, and you mix the age groups. Don't separate by grade. Older kids explain things to younger kids. Younger kids ask questions that older kids can't dismiss. Everyone's teaching someone. Camille nodded. And I want to be clear about something, Dean said. He looked at her directly. If I'm involved in designing this, I'm not going to manage it as a program director or whatever the title would be. I don't want to sit in meetings. I want to be in the room with the kids. That's fine. And I keep my job. She paused. You want to keep the maintenance job. Caleb's schedule is what it is. The night shift works for us. He said it without apology or defensiveness, the same way he said everything as information, offered plainly. I can design the program, and I can teach in it, and I can be available for planning conversations at reasonable times. But I'm not taking an executive position, and I'm not being in the building during hours that conflict with being home in the morning. Camille thought about the 41-page file, the 2-year-old standing in a doorway, the $22 an hour, and the deliberate choice it represented. I understand, she said, and I'm not going to try to renegotiate that. He looked at her for a moment, checking whether she meant it. She held his gaze. He nodded once. Okay, he said. What's the timeline? I'd like to open in 6 months. I want it ready before the end of the school year, so families can plan for it over the summer. 6 months is tight. I know. It's doable, he said, if the build-out doesn't get bogged down in approval chains. I'll manage the approval chains, she said. You focus on what the room needs to be. He turned his coffee mug one more time and looked at it. I want to call it the open table, he said. No logo. No branding, just the name. She wrote it down. Done. 6 months is tight, and those 6 months were tight in the specific way that real projects are tight, not dramatically, not with a single crisis that tests everyone's resolve, but with the grinding accumulation of small logistical problems that required constant tending. The build-out took 3 weeks longer than planned because of an electrical issue in the floor's existing infrastructure that nobody had caught in the initial assessment, which meant the furniture installation was delayed, which meant the volunteer recruitment timeline had to be compressed. 3 of the volunteers Camille had confirmed dropped out for personal reasons in the 4th month, requiring replacements on short notice. The city's building permit process moved at the speed of a building permit process, which is to say geological. Dean was not involved in any of this, which was the correct decision and which she reminded herself of several times during the difficult weeks. He was involved in what he was involved in, the design of the learning structure, the development of the teaching modules, the physical layout of the room. He came to 3 planning meetings, arrived exactly on time at all 3, said what needed to be said without surplus, and left when the agenda was complete. He sent her detailed written notes on the room design that were precise and specific and would have been called, in another context, a very good architectural brief. He also, in the second month, brought Priya Anand into it. Camille heard about this secondhand. Priya mentioned it at an engineering review, almost in passing, that she'd talked to Dean about teaching a module on pattern recognition for kids aged 9 through 12, and that she was thinking about how to structure it. She said this in the tone of someone who had found themselves interested in something they hadn't expected to be interested in, and was still working out how to present that fact professionally. Camille said, "That's great. Let Marcus know your availability." And Priya said, "I already did," and that was that. Tom Selleck, and his name was still what it was, immovably volunteered to teach a module on how information systems work, which he described to Camille as basically trying to explain to a 12-year-old why it matters who controls the pipes and not just the water, and which sounded, she thought, like exactly the kind of lesson that the past several months had made newly relevant. Marcus taught mathematics. He was nervous about it initially, which he admitted to Camille with the rueful candor of a man who had discovered that knowing something and being able to explain it to a skeptical 9-year-old were not the same skill. Dean told him to stop preparing and start listening, which Marcus found annoying and which turned out to be correct. Dolores, the overnight cleaning crew manager, agreed to teach what she called a session on how buildings actually work, the systems and logistics of a large physical space, the invisible competencies required to keep it functional, and she delivered it with a directness and specificity that Dean said afterward was one of the best teaching sessions he'd seen. "She doesn't condescend," he told Camille, sitting in the new room the week before the opening, while Ruby and Caleb were trying out the tables and arguing about the optimal chair height. "She just tells them what's true. Kids respond to that. Adults respond to that too," Camille said. "Fewer of them, though," he said, and she couldn't argue with it. The open table opened on a Saturday in early spring, which was a warm morning with the particular tentative brightness of a season that hasn't quite committed yet. 43 children came on the first day, the children of engineers, accountants, security guards, administrative staff, cleaning crew, IT technicians, and one child who was the daughter of Nexora's CEO. That last child arrived early, helped Dean arrange chairs, argued with Caleb about the chair arrangement, and ultimately prevailed on 2 of the 4 tables before conceding the other 2. By 10 o'clock, every table was full. Camille stood at the back of the room and watched. What struck her first was the noise level, which was higher than she'd expected, not chaotic, but the concentrated noise of children who are actually working at something, the sound of argument and explanation, and the particular verbal scrambling that happens when someone is trying to find words for something they understand but haven't said out loud before. At one table, a 9-year-old whose father drove a delivery truck for Nexora's logistics operation was explaining something to a 12-year-old whose mother was a senior software architect, and the 12-year-old was listening in the slightly humbled way of someone who has just been shown a gap in their understanding by an unexpected source. At another table, Dean was working with 4 children on a navigation problem. He had a large sheet of paper in the center of the table with a simple map drawn on it: coastline, currents, 3 possible routes, and he was saying nothing, just watching while the 4 of them argued about which route was correct and why. One of the children, a small girl with braids who Camille didn't recognize, was making her case with considerable force, and the other 3 were pushing back, and Dean was watching all 4 of them with the particular attention that she had first seen in a basement break room, and had since learned to recognize as his most essential quality: the look of a person who genuinely believes the person in front of them is capable of getting there on their own. The small girl with braids turned out to be right. The route she had argued for was correct. When Dean confirmed it, the other 3 made the sounds children make when they've been bested by a peer, which involved some protest, and then, quickly, curiosity about how she'd gotten there. She explained it, and they listened, because children, more reliably than adults, will accept a correct answer from anyone when the evidence is clear. Ruby was at a table in the corner with Caleb and 2 other children, working through something on graph paper that Camille couldn't see clearly from across the room. Ruby was explaining, which she did with her hands as much as her words. She gestured at the paper, drew something in the air, waited while one of the other children tried to follow, and then started again from a different angle without visible frustration. Camille watched her daughter explain something to another child for 10 minutes and felt something shift in her chest that was quiet and large and did not have a clean name. She had spent 5 years trying to understand what Ruby needed. She had tried therapists and enrichment programs and weekend activities and the best school in the city and every form of provision she could quantify. She had done it with genuine love and genuine exhaustion and a genuine failure to see that what she was providing was resources, and what Ruby needed was presence, not just hers, though that too, but the presence of someone who believed the problem was worth her time and was willing to stay with it until she solved it. A janitor had seen that in the time it took to walk a mop down a hallway. Camille had needed several months, a corporate sabotage crisis, a 41-page background report, and a considerable amount of discomfort to arrive at the same understanding. She was not going to pretend that didn't cost her something to acknowledge. It did. But she had also learned from a man who had walked away from prestige without resentment and chosen a life that looked small from the outside, and was not that acknowledgement was not defeat. It was just information. You took it and you adjusted your heading, and you kept going. She had been adjusting her heading. She left work earlier now. Not every day, there were still days when the company required what the company required. And she was not going to pretend she had achieved some perfect recalibration, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing things halfway, and that was not a quality that evaporated because she'd experienced a lesson. But she left earlier more often than she had. She was home for dinner 2 or 3 nights a week instead of 1. She attended 2 of Ruby's school presentations in the spring, actually attended them, sat in the audience, watched her daughter explain a project on geometric patterns in architecture with the calm authority of a child who had learned that she could trust her own thinking. She went to bed at a reasonable hour with some regularity and discovered, with mild shock, that she thought more clearly the next morning. She was not a different person. She was the same person making different choices, which is harder than becoming a different person and more honest about what change actually requires. Ruby asked, one evening in April, whether she could start teaching at the open table. She said it at dinner, between the pasta and the part of the meal where she usually retreated into the book she'd smuggled to the table. She said it with the directness she'd developed, or possibly always had, and had simply stopped hiding of someone who had decided that stated preferences were more efficient than hinted ones. Camille looked at her. You want to teach. Caleb does it already. He taught a session on map reading last week. Ruby wound pasta around her fork. I could do the number pattern stuff, the beginner level, for the younger kids. I've watched Mr. Dean do it enough times, Mr. Dean, Camille said. You've been working with him for almost 8 months. You could probably use his first name. Ruby considered this with the gravity she gave to questions of protocol. He hasn't said I could. He'd say you could, I know. But he hasn't. She ate a bite of pasta. Can I teach? I'll ask him, Camille said, but I think yes. Ruby nodded, satisfied, and reached for her book. Camille watched her for a moment. Ruby, at 8 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a book about cryptography and a half-eaten plate of pasta, perfectly at ease in her own company, in a way she had not been 6 months ago. Not repaired, that implied there had been a break, when what there had been was more like a long drought, something essential not getting through. That had changed. Ruby was still guarded with people she didn't know, still more comfortable with problems than with small talk, still capable of a focused silence that could last 40 minutes and emerge into a fully formed observation that caught you completely off guard. She was still, in all the ways that mattered, exactly herself. She was just more so, more present in it, more willing to let it take up space. Dean had given her that. The regular lessons, the harder problems, the simple refusal to treat her as either a trophy or a fragile thing. But Camille had given her something too. In these last months, not the earlier departures from work or the attended presentations or the kitchen table dinners, though all of those mattered. Something more foundational. She had looked at her daughter and stopped seeing what she'd expected to see and started trying to see what was actually there. That was the thing she'd been missing, she thought. Not time. Exactly, though time was part of it. The willingness to look without an agenda. To sit in a basement break room, metaphorically speaking, and see a girl solving number patterns on discarded paper and think, what does she need to go further? Rather than what have I already arranged for her? She'd been arranging things for Ruby for years. She was only now learning to look. In May, Camille offered Dean a formal role. She did it carefully, because she had learned something about how he received offers. He took them seriously, weighed them against what he actually valued, and said no without guilt when they didn't fit. She wanted to make him an offer that fit. She called it Program Architect, which was a title that existed on no good chart Nexora had previously maintained. The role involved designing and evolving the Open Tables curriculum, mentoring the volunteer teachers, and serving as the primary point of contact for the program's operational needs. It was 4 days a week, flexible hours structured around his evening shift. It came with a salary that was, she told him directly, significantly more than what you're currently making, but less than what a program director at a comparable institution would expect, because you told me you didn't want a program director role, and I'm trying to match the title to the work rather than to a benchmark. He had looked at the offer letter for a long moment. You're still paying for my night shift hours separately. Your maintenance contract stays as is. This is additional. Why? She had thought about how to answer that. Because the maintenance work is how you structure your time with Caleb, and I don't want to give you financial incentive to trade that structure for a different one, she said. That decision should stay yours. He read the letter again. There's a line in here about educational support, he said. Nexora will fund coursework in applied mathematics or education or any related field you want to pursue, she said, at whatever pace makes sense for your life. No timeline, no performance conditions on the scholarship. It's available when you want it and on hold when you don't. A long pause. Caleb told me last week that he wants to study urban planning, Dean said. It didn't seem like a non sequitur. Camille waited. He said he wants to figure out why some neighborhoods have good schools and others don't, and whether that can be fixed with better design. He set the letter down. He's 10. He's your son, Camille said. Something crossed Dean's face, not sentimentality. Something more private than that, more specific. The look of a parent who has watched a child become something and recognized in it the particular satisfaction of having been present for it without controlling it. Okay, he said. I'll sign it. She slid a pen across the table. He signed it without ceremony and slid it back. I have one condition, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Ruby teaches the beginner number session on Saturdays. She asked me last week. He looked at Camille with an expression that was level and calm and contained somewhere inside it the kind of warmth that doesn't announce itself. She's ready, Camille said. I know. She told me too. She's going to be annoyed that we talked about it without her. She'll survive it. He picked up his coffee, and for a moment there was quiet in the office, the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The city was doing what it always did outside the window, and the building was doing what buildings do in the middle of a workday. And 2 floors below them, in a room with good light and tables arranged without hierarchy, a space existed now that had not existed 8 months ago, because a woman had been willing to be wrong about where answers come from, and a man had been willing to say yes to something that didn't require him to trade the life he'd built for the recognition he'd earned. Neither of those things had been easy. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself. She had not gracefully and gradually evolved into a wiser person. She had been pushed toward it by a crisis she hadn't anticipated. An 8-year-old's retreat into silence, and a 41-page report about a man who had chosen differently than her, and turned out to have been right about things she'd been wrong about. That was not a triumphant story arc. It was a more ordinary one. The kind that most real changes come from, not inspiration but friction, not revelation but the slow accumulation of evidence that something you believed was actually wrong. She was still not always home for dinner. She still sometimes took calls during Ruby's homework time and felt the specific guilt of a parent who knows better and does it anyway. She had not solved the fundamental tension between the company she'd built and the life she was still figuring out how to live inside it, because that tension was structural and would not be resolved by a single decision or a single shift in priorities. It required ongoing negotiation with herself, which was uncomfortable, which was apparently how growth worked, whether you wanted it to or not. But she was doing the negotiation. She was showing up for it. That was the thing Dean had taught her that she hadn't expected to learn. Not the lesson about overlooked people, though that was real and she carried it. Not the lesson about upstream problems and correct assumptions, though she used that one weekly. The thing he had taught her by example rather than instruction was that deciding what matters and then organizing your life around it was not a single act but a practice. You did it every day, imperfectly, and you adjusted and kept going. And the measure of it wasn't whether you ever got it perfectly right, but whether you kept trying to be honest about what you actually valued when it cost you something to value it. He valued his son and he valued teaching, and he had arranged his life at considerable personal cost to protect both, and he did not appear to regret any of it. She was still learning how to do that. She was not sure she would ever be as clear about it as he seemed to be. But she was learning. which was different from where she'd been a year ago, and different she had learned to be specific about this was what mattered. The Open Table's first anniversary fell on a Saturday in early spring, 1 year and 2 weeks after the Halcyon demonstration. The program had grown. What had started with 43 children had become a regular Saturday attendance of over 90, with a waiting list that Camille had declined to cap arbitrarily and was instead managing by expanding the program's volunteer pool and extending the Saturday hours. 4 additional Nexora employees had taken on regular teaching roles. A company on the floor above Nexora had contacted Camille about establishing a similar program in their building, using the Open Table's design as a template, which Dean had agreed to share openly with the very specific requirement that they not charge families for access and not put a corporate logo on the room. Ruby taught beginner number patterns on the first and third Saturdays of each month. She had adjusted her approach twice based on what wasn't working. The first month she'd been too fast, she said, which she acknowledged with the matter-of-fact candor of someone who had learned from Dean that identifying your own errors was more useful than defending against them. She'd slowed down, developed a habit of asking questions before explaining, and by the third month had a regular group of 6 younger children who arrived early specifically to get seats at her table. Caleb had started teaching map reading on alternate Saturdays and had begun, with Dean's encouragement, attending a weekend program in urban design at the city's community college, which had a class for high school-age students that had agreed to make an exception for a 10th grader level 10-year-old with, as the instructor had written to Dean, unusual spatial reasoning and a persistent habit of asking questions nobody has bothered to answer before. Dean taught mathematics logic, and what he described on the program flyer simply as thinking under uncertainty, which turned out to be the most popular session of every Saturday, and which regularly ran 20 minutes over because the children refused to stop asking questions. He also started taking classes of his own. He enrolled in an applied mathematics program at the city university, evenings and online, at a pace he described to Camille as slow, because I'm not in a hurry and Caleb needs me home. He was the oldest person in most of his classes by 15 years, and had, according to his own account, been asked twice by younger students whether he was auditing for work, and had explained both times that he was a janitor who also ran a learning program and had always intended to finish the degree, and the students had looked at him with an expression he found privately amusing. He was not in a hurry. He was, as he had always been, doing the work in front of him at the pace that work required. On the anniversary Saturday, the room was full. Children at every table, noise at the right level, the smell of dry erase markers, and the particular warmth of a room with a lot of bodies in it doing something that requires concentration. Volunteer teachers scattered through the space. At the center table, Dean had set up what the kids had started calling the hard problem, a new challenge each week, left on the table when the room opened, no instructions, no facilitator, just a problem that required collaboration to approach. This week it was a physical puzzle involving string and wooden blocks that apparently required at least 3 people working together before it made any sense at all, and 6 children were crowded around it in various stages of frustration and breakthrough. Camille arrived at 10 o'clock, which was 90 minutes after the room opened, because she'd been at a board meeting that she'd scheduled to end by 9:45, and which had, characteristically, run long. She did not apologize for being late. She noted it and moved on. She stood at the back of the room for a few minutes, watching. At 11:30, Ruby stood up from her table. She had asked, 2 weeks ago, whether she could present something at the anniversary. She'd said it the way she said things now directly, without preamble, and Camille had said yes, and told Dean, and Dean had said fine, and told her to keep it under 10 minutes, because the kids' attention didn't survive longer than that. And Ruby had said she knew. She'd been teaching them for months. Ruby went to the whiteboard at the front of the room and picked up a marker. The room settled gradually. Children who had been mid-problem looked up. The adults along the walls paid attention. Dean put down his marker and watched. Ruby wrote an equation on the board. Not a simple one, it was a probability expression that had several moving parts and required understanding 3 separate concepts to approach. She wrote it without explaining it first, which was deliberate, and then she turned to the room and said, "Who thinks they can't do this?" Most of the younger children raised their hands. Several of the older ones, and all of the adults, didn't raise their hands, but also didn't reach for a marker, which was its own answer. "Okay," Ruby said. She wasn't nervous. She was, if anything, impatient to get started, which was characteristic. I'm going to show you how I learned this, not the answer how I learned. And what I want you to notice is how many wrong attempts it took before the right approach made sense. She started writing. She didn't show them the solution. She showed them her process, the first attempt, which was wrong, the second attempt, which was also wrong in a different direction, the point where she'd gotten frustrated and gone back to what she definitely knew, the moment when something had clicked. She showed them the click in slow motion, which was harder than just showing the answer, and required her to actually think backward through her own understanding, which she did with visible effort and occasional pauses, where she clearly had to stop and find the right way in. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when something real is happening. When she finished, she set down the marker. She looked at the children who had raised their hands. "The reason I can do this now," she said, "is because someone gave me a harder problem when I thought I needed an easier one." She paused, and then he waited. She looked at Dean. Dean was leaning against the side wall with his arms crossed, and his expression was the one he wore when something had resolved correctly, not proud. Exactly, because pride implied the outcome was about him, and it wasn't. Something more like the quiet satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered, and having been patient enough to wait for the proof. Camille was watching from the back of the room. She had cried exactly twice in the past year, once at 3 a.m. during the worst of the Graham investigation, sitting on her kitchen floor with a glass of water and the specific despair that comes at 3 a.m. when you're not sure the thing you're fighting for is going to hold, and once the previous November, when Ruby had come downstairs during a dinner party and patiently explained to one of Camille's board members why his assumptions about her attention span were incorrect. The first was private. The second she'd excused herself for. She did not cry now. She stood at the back of the room and felt something quieter than tears. Something that had weight and warmth and was not dramatic in any of the ways that things are supposed to be dramatic when they matter. She watched her daughter put down the marker. She watched Ruby scan the room once, with the assessing look she'd always had, and then move quickly through the tables toward the side wall where Dean and Caleb were standing. She moved the way she moved when she'd finished something, and wanted to be back in the work efficiently, without ceremony. She reached Dean and Caleb and stopped. Caleb said something to her. Camille couldn't hear it from across the room, and Ruby said something back, and Caleb laughed. And Ruby looked like she was working to keep her expression neutral and not entirely succeeding. Dean said something to both of them, and they looked at him, and then at each other, and then the three of them turned to the room, where the morning was continuing around them. Children returning to their problems. The hard problem table erupting in a small argument about string tension. Someone calling for a marker. Camille watched them for a moment. 3 people standing at a wall, a man who had chosen presence over prestige, a 10-year-old who wanted to redesign neighborhoods, and her daughter, who had spent 3 years in the careful withdrawal of a child, who had stopped trusting that the hard problems were worth attempting. She crossed the room. She didn't say anything when she reached them. She stood beside Ruby, who glanced up at her and then back at the room, the comfortable sideways acknowledgement of a child who knows their parent is there and is satisfied by that fact without needing to perform it. Dean looked at her briefly. "She went 2 minutes over," he said. "You told her 10 minutes, Camille said. "She told me she knew." He said it without irritation. "She was right, though," Caleb said, because he was 10 years old, and fairness was a principle he applied without exception. "She was," Dean said. "She still went over." Ruby did not acknowledge this conversation, which was a choice. Camille stood in that room, 4,000 square feet, on the 23rd floor. Good, light, tables without hierarchy, the noise of children doing real work, and she thought about a conference room on the 31st floor, 1 year and several months ago, and a child standing at a whiteboard humming. She thought about a basement break room that smelled of industrial cleaner. She thought about a 41-page file and the line that had stayed with her. Every person I spoke with who knows him said roughly the same thing. He's the most capable person they've ever worked with, who actively chose not to be recognized for it. She had spent her career building a company that recognized capability with titles and salaries and visibility, and all of that was real and had its value. But she had learned slowly, imperfectly, at some cost to her certainty about things she'd been certain of that recognition was not the same as seeing. You could be recognized without being seen. You could be invisible and still be exactly where you intended to be. You could clean floors in a building full of people who crossed them without learning your name, and teach a lonely child mathematics with coins and paper cups, and quietly identify the thing that everyone else was looking past, and the quality of your life did not require anyone's acknowledgement to be what it was. Dean had known that. He had built his life inside it. Camille was learning it. It was harder than she'd expected, and more important than she'd been ready to admit. And she was not finished learning it and did not expect to be. Because the things that are actually true about how to live don't arrive complete and then stay. You have to keep arriving at them every day in the specific circumstances of your specific life. She was trying to keep arriving. In the room around her, the morning continued. Problems being worked, explanations being offered, the particular democracy of a hard question that doesn't care whose parents are executives and whose are not. Ruby at the side wall, watching, already thinking about next Saturday's session. Caleb leaning his head back against the wall, following some train of thought toward neighborhoods and design, and the 11 years of life he had so far and all the time ahead of him to figure out what to do with it. Dean looking at the room with the attention that was his most essential quality, the look of someone who sees what is actually there and has decided it is worth staying for. Outside, the city did what cities do, indifferent to the small rooms inside large buildings, where the particular work of paying attention was being done. In here it was enough. It was in fact exactly enough.